All right, we're going to talk about data types and how to work with data in JavaScript. So JavaScript has 7 primitive data types. We're going to talk about each one of these. We're going to talk about some of them in upcoming slides. Some of them we'll talk about later in the course. So we have numbers. And numbers hold exactly what you would think they hold. They hold numbers. They hold integers and floating point types. Strings hold characters. Characters or strings of text, strings of characters, alphanumeric characters, however you want to think about that. Booleans are true and false. Symbol is a new data type that was introduced in ES6, which is, I think, 2016. It's used to create unique identifiers as properties for objects, and it's kind of a way to make sure objects don't have identifiers with the same name as one that's in another object. That will come much later in the book. We'll discuss that a little bit more. The null data type and the undefined data type are really closely related, but they're used differently. Undefined is used by JavaScript to indicate that an object hasn't been given any value by a programmer. So we haven't assigned a value. The null value is used by the programmer to actually purposely set something to no value. Okay, so those two things are very close, and in some languages you might consider them the same thing, but JavaScript actually treats them different. Again, undefined means we've never set anything, and null means we purposely set it to nothing. And then big int type was created just a couple years ago. It's a new primitive data type built into JavaScript, and it's meant to hold really, really big numbers, but also really, really small numbers. So let's look at some number values. So here's 15. It's an integer. Here's negative 21. That's a negative integer. It's fine. It's a number. These are all examples of numbers. 21.5 is a decimal value. Negative 124.82 is a negative decimal value. Negative 3.7 times 10 to the negative 9th that's floating point notation, or scientific notation, if you will, or negative 0.0000, a bunch of zeros, 37. So a number can be an integer or a decimal. In JavaScript, decimal values are stored as floating point numbers. And here's something interesting. If a result is stored in a number data type and it's larger than the data type can store, so if it's a 32-bit number and we do a number that's large enough that it would take more than 32 bits, it ends up being stored as the value infinity. Or if it's super, super negative big number, negative infinity. Little quirk of JavaScript. String values in JavaScript are enclosed in double quotes, or you can enclose them in single quotes. An empty string can be a set of double quotes following each other. We could do that also with single quotes. So a string value, or a string literal, is surrounded by double quotes or single quotes. It must start and end with the same type of quotation. So if we start it with a single quote, we have to end it with a single quote. And an empty string is a string that doesn't have any characters in it. We make that by typing 2 quotation marks with nothing. Boolean values are values that are either true or false. So the Boolean data type can only be those two conditions, true or false. We use those a lot in conditional statements, which we'll look at later. So let's look at how to declare and initialize a variable. To initialize a variable, we use the keyword let. And then we assign a variable name Actually, let's say it a different way. We use the keyword let, and then we declare a variable name and assign the value on the right side of the equals to that variable. So here's an example. I have an identifier, which is, in this case, it's a variable. It's going to hold a number. So I'm assigning the number 1 to the variable count. And I've declared that variable by using the keyword let in front of it. Here's using a decimal number, 74.95. I'm assigning it to the variable I declared as subtotal. Here's email. I'm assigning an empty string to it. So the thing on the right, the value on the right, gets assigned to the variable on the left at all times. We always use let to declare our variables. Now, you will find out that there is another way to declare variables using, or any identifier, using the var keyword, VAR. And that's how JavaScript used to do it. And there's some problems with that we're going to talk about in an upcoming slide. So when you declare variables, do not use VAR, use let. That is good coding practice now with the modern versions of JavaScript. If we're reassigning the value of a variable, the first time we use it, we have to declare it using the let keyword. So here's an example. Let the count equal 1, assigns 1 to the variable count. But in subsequent lines, if I want to add 1 to count, I don't use the keyword let again. I declare it the first time. We declare it the first time we use it, and then we can use it through here. And here I'm doing it twice. This takes the item on the right, which is the value of count, and it adds 1 to it, and it stores it in the variable on the left side of the assignment, which is the same variable. So if count was equal to 5, it's going to take 5 plus 1, it's going to get 6, and it's going to store that value back in the variable count. I guess the assignment, we initialized it to 1 here. Terrible example. We initialized it to 1, and here we took 1 plus 1, and it became 2, and we assigned it to count on 2. So we can also declare constants. So let declares variables. The word const is short for constant, assigns an identifier as a constant. So we take a value, we assign it to that constant. The only difference between a variable that we did over on this page and a constant is that once we assign it, it can never be changed. So down here, we declared a constant called count equal to 1. So count is 1. And then the next line, we took count and tried to add 1 to it to get 2 and store it back in there. Can't do it. Once a constant receives a value, it can no longer be changed. And that comes in very handy. There's times when we don't want our identifiers, the value of our identifiers to change. All right, so this is important to how JavaScript works. And it explains some things with the differences between var and let. So let's talk about how JavaScript processes these variables that we're going to be using in our code. So I have a big page full of JavaScript. Before it runs, JavaScript goes through the code and places all the variables and constant declarations in memory. Before it ever runs a line of code, it looks through the code, finds all the variable and constant declarations, and places them in memory first. And that's a process that's called hoisting. When the variable that's declared with the var keyword, the one I said you shouldn't really use anymore, when it's hoisted, JavaScript means when it's hoisted means when JavaScript scans the code first to look for all the variables. JavaScript initializes that variable with the value of undefined, which we talked about that undefined value. Because of this, we can access the variable before we declare it, since it looks in advance through the code. And we're going to see an example on the next screen. But the value will be undefined, and that could be dangerous. We don't really want variables to have values of undefined. However, if we use the let keyword, when we use the let keyword, the variable is still hoisted, but JavaScript doesn't initialize it. So it doesn't get that undefined value. That's also true of constants. If it sees a constant in there, as long as it's declared with the let keyword, JavaScript doesn't initialize it, and we can't access it before we actually declare it. Let's look at an example. So here's an example, 2 lines of code. The second one, the second line of code, we declare a variable using that var keyword of value 1, and it's a string called value. So the minute we run our code, JavaScript scans through it. It says, oh, there's a variable there called val1. And it doesn't initialize it to value. It initializes it to undefined. Okay. Because it knows that variable exists and it's initialized to undefined, if we try to use it, it lets us use it. So here's an alert statement that is going to pop up a box and show us the value of val1, but it ends up displaying undefined instead of the value that we probably wanted to have in there because we used it before we declared it. In most programming languages, you have to declare variables before you use them. And so that was a problem in JavaScript. Okay? So here's an example again, doing it probably the correct way using var. Var value1 equals value. So we declared it here and then we alert it and it actually displays value. And it works fine because we did it in the correct order. So using var lets us do it in the incorrect order. And it can cause some problems. Let's compare that to using the keyword let. If I do the same thing that I had up here, but instead of var, I use let. So I declare a value here, and I try to alert it before we get to this line, we get a reference error. It actually causes an error, which is a good thing because we have a logic problem up here that wasn't discovered when we ran this. And the logic problem is we tried to use a variable before we actually initialized it. Down here, it doesn't let us do it. It actually gives us an error so that we know and we can fix it and we don't have a bug in our code. The proper way to do it is to declare the variable and then use it however we want to use it. In this case, we're displaying it with an alert. So this is a good example of why you should use let and not var for your variables. I think that was changed in 2016. That was added, perhaps. That sounds right to me. Don't quote me on the year, but it's somewhere around there. It might have been 15. I can't remember. But it was a very, very good change. So use let, don't use var. All right, so we talked about variables, we talked about constants, we talked about how to declare a variable or constant, and we talked about initializing it. We talked about the assignment statement, with the equal sign, assigning the thing on the right to the item on the left, and the assignment operator, which is the equal sign. We talked about literal values when we talked about strings. I guess we talked about them in numbers too. But literal values, or literals, means we're actually working with a number or a string in quotes. We're not working with a variable. So we talked about string literals, number literals, and we talked about hoisting. And I didn't actually use the words TDZ for temporal dead zone when I talked about this over here. But the time between when something's hoisted and when it was actually declared is technically called the temporal dead zone. It's that time where you shouldn't be using it because it's going to display undefined. Again, that gets fixed by just using let. All right, that does it for this video. We're going to start looking at expressions and using some of the operators to work with numbers and strings in the next video.